Okay, so in this lesson we're going to discuss the distributive property. And before we discuss the distributive property, let's look at this example for a moment. Suppose we had this numerical expression. We had 2 times, and then let's say 3 plus 4. And so in a previous lesson, you used in the previous lesson you used the order of operations. So let's talk about the order of operations with this order of operations. And so remember, in the order of operations, in this case, you have multiplication, you have a grouping symbol, and inside this grouping symbol, you have addition. So remember, in terms of the order of operation, with regards to what we see here, we're going to do the grouping symbol first. Now, inside the grouping symbol is just the addition operation. So let's do the addition operation first. So this becomes 2 times, and then 3 plus 4 is 7. So we get 2 times 7, or we can just write it as 2 times 7 like this. And so 2 times 7 is 14. Okay? Now, I want you to notice something. If I wrote this right here as this, to see if we get this 14, if I wrote this as 2 times 3 plus 2 times 4, notice what we get. 2 times 3 is 6, plus, and then 2 times 4 is 8, and it turns out that 8 plus 6 is also 14. So this numerical expression using the order of operation gives us 14, and this numerical expression, which I wrote like this, also gives us 14. So if you look at this, see this 3 and the 4? I am multiplying the 3 and the 4, both of these terms, by this number that's right here, the 2. So you're basically saying, go ahead and write it here, you are basically saying that this expression is the same thing as saying 2 times 3 plus, and then 2 times 4. So you are distributing the 2 to each of those numbers inside the parentheses. And so this is called the distributive property. So that's the distributive property. All right, so everything inside that parentheses, I'm going to multiply by this number that's on the outside, because this says 2 times 3 plus 4. Now, the more correct name for this is the distributive property of multiplication over addition. And so notice that I'm going to multiply multiplication. I'm going to multiply these two numbers over addition. So this operation inside is an addition problem. So the distributive property, in order to use the distributive property, this symbol right here has to be addition. Now it could also be subtraction, because remember, subtraction means adding the opposites. You can always write a subtraction problem as an addition problem. So this must always be an addition problem right here inside this parentheses before you can use the distributive property. So over addition. And so we just simplify this. 2 times 3 is 6, plus 2 times 4 is 8, and so you get an answer of 14. Now, the more general rule is this. So let's talk about the distributive property. Let's give it a definition. Distributive property of multiplication over addition. Okay, so basically it says if you have a times b plus c, then I can multiply each of those terms by that number on the outside. So basically I'm going to say a times b plus a times c. So this becomes a times b plus a times c. All right, so that's the distributive property of multiplication over addition. And you could have more than 2 terms in here. So however many terms you have in here, you're going to multiply by the number that's on the outside. Now, notice normally is going to be written as some number times, in parentheses, a bunch of terms. But it could also be written like this. You could also have said b plus c times a. And so you would also use the distributive property. So you'd say A times B plus A times C. All right, so just remember multiplication from a previous lesson. Multiplication is commutative. The order in which you multiply does not matter. So A times B plus C is the same as saying B plus C times A. Okay, so the thing that allows us to do that, so remember that will be B times A plus C times A, which is the same thing as these. Okay, all right, so remember the commutative property of multiplication. So the commutative property of multiplication says the order in which you multiply does not matter. So that's why you can say A times B plus C is the same thing as saying B plus C times A. All right. Okay, so let's look at some examples with using the distributive property. It's not a difficult lesson. It's fairly simple. You just got to remember that when using distributive property, everything that's inside the parentheses, you're going to be multiplying by this number that's on the outside, because it does mean A times B plus C. It'll be A times B plus A times C. All right. Okay, so let's look at this example. Right now, the directions will say use the distributive property. Use the distributive property. To write each expression without parentheses. All right. And then, if possible, simplify the result. So simplify the result if possible. Okay, so you see what you're going to see what we're going to mean by that. Okay, so let's look at this example. So we can just write these as examples. Examples. Number 1. All right, we have this. 9 times x minus 6. All right, so I can use the distributive property here. So everything that's inside this parentheses, I'm going to multiply by 9. So I'm going to kind of write it like this. All right, so 9 times x is 9x. And then 9 times a negative 6 is a negative 54. All right, so that would be your answer, 9x minus 54. And you cannot simplify this. Notice we have to simplify the result if possible, because these are not like terms. All right, 9x and 54 you cannot combine, so you're done. Okay, number 2, suppose we had, let's say we had this, 2 times 3x plus 5. All right, same idea, just like with this one. You're going to multiply everything that's inside the parentheses, all these terms here, by the number that's on the outside. Now, sometimes it helps if you draw this arrow like this. So you're saying 2 times 3x, and then 2 times 5. So basically you're saying this. You're saying 2 times 3x plus 2 times 5. That's what you're saying. Now again, you can skip this step, but in your mind, that's what you're saying. You're saying 2 times 3x plus, and then 2 times 5. And then you get 6x plus 10. All right? And so you cannot simplify that. Now be a little bit careful. In your mind, and some of you could write this, you can write it like this, but that's not the answer. So don't leave this as the answer. So besides combining like terms, another part of simplifying the result is to make sure you say 2 times 3x is 6x, and then 2 times 5 is 10. All right, so you got to make sure you do that. All right, and that'll be the answer there. But again, you can go from here to the answer. I mean, it's fairly simple just to say 2 times 3x is 6x, 2 times 5 is 10. All right, let's look at this one. All right, number 3. Suppose we had this in number 3. Number 3. All right, suppose we had negative 2 times 2x plus 5. Negative 2 times 3x plus 5. Okay, well this time I'm multiplying everything that's inside the parentheses by negative 2. And again, in your mind, you're thinking, all right, well I'm going to say negative 2 times 2x plus and then negative 2 times 5. All right, and that's definitely what you're doing. Again, don't leave the answer like this. Now you can actually skip this step if you need to, and then just go to the answer. And so the answer would be negative 2 times 2x is negative 4x, and then negative 2 times 5 is negative 10. Now this is the way we prefer to write it. So write it as negative 4x minus 10. There's nothing wrong with saying negative 4x plus a negative 10. All right, but that's not the way we normally write this, because you're supposed to know that plus a negative 10, this right here, means the same thing as subtraction. All right, so notice that this right here means the same thing. So we prefer to write it like this. So make sure you write it like this. Okay, number 4. All right, suppose we had this. Suppose we had negative 3 times 5x minus 2 this time. All right, so we're going to do the distributive property. And I'm going to go ahead and write in this step like I did before. So you're going to say negative 3 times 5x, and then minus negative 3 times 2. Negative 3 times 2. Just write it like this. Now, you got to be a little bit careful here. You're going to say negative 15x, because a negative 3 times positive 5x, negative 15x. Now, technically, this becomes subtract a negative 6. All right, negative 3 times 2 is a negative 6. But remember, in a previous course, subtracting a negative number, you should always change this to an addition problem. So this becomes adding the opposite of negative 6, which is a positive 6. And so this becomes negative 15x plus 6. All right, now, that is the long way of doing this. All you had to do was think of it this way. A negative 3 times 5x, a negative 3, let me go ahead and rewrite it over. A negative 3 times 5x is a negative 15x, and a negative 3 times a negative 2 is a positive 6. And notice how quick this is. That was a lot quicker than just saying all of this right here. Okay? All right, number 5. Okay, number 5, suppose we had this. Suppose we had negative 4 times 1 minus 3m plus n. Suppose we had that. Okay, so negative 4 times 1 minus 3m plus n. Let's just go ahead and use the distributive property right off the bat. And I'm going to kind of skip some steps here, but notice how complicated this becomes if you kind of write it like this. It's sometimes easier just to go ahead and in your mind just say negative 3 times 5x is a negative 15x. And remember, a negative times a negative is a positive, so a negative 3 times a negative 2 is a negative 6. I'm sorry, a positive 6. So we can use that idea here. A negative 4 times a positive 1 is a negative 4. A negative 4 times a negative 3m is a positive 12m, because a negative times a negative is a positive. And a negative 4 times a positive n is a negative 4n. And you can't combine anything, so there's your answer right here. All right, now number 6. Okay, so before we do number 6, let's kind of, well, that's fine. We can do this as number 6. Let's suppose in number 6 I had this. I had negative 1 times 3x minus 2y plus 5. Let's say we had that. All right, and so, again, using the distributive property, I'm going to say negative 1 times 3x, negative 1 times a negative 2y, and then a negative 1 times a positive 5. And so I get negative 1 times 3x is a negative 3x. A negative 1 times a negative 2y. So a negative times a negative is a positive, first of all. 1 times 2 is 2. So negative 1 times a negative 2y is a positive 2y. And then a negative 1 times a positive 5 is a negative 5. So there's your answer there. All right, now, what if you had this? What if I had something look like this? And let's say this is 2x minus, let's say plus 7 for right now. This is my expression. Okay, so if you look at this right here, and in all the problems we've had, there was a number that I could actually see. Negative 1 times all this in parentheses. Negative 4 times all this in parentheses. Negative 3 times all this in parentheses. Negative 2 times all this in parentheses. Right here, all I see is this subtraction symbol or this negative symbol out in front of the parentheses. I want you to know that this right here is the same as saying this. If there's no number there, it's understood to be a 1. So this becomes a negative 1. So it becomes a negative 1, just like we had here. Okay? So you're going to distribute a negative 1. So negative 1 times 2x is a negative 2x. And negative 1 times a positive 7 is a negative 7. All right? Now, what some students do, and it's fine, they will say this, well, I'm going to distribute the negative 3 here. So this 2x, now remember in a previous course that if you think of this as a subtraction symbol, you're adding the opposite. So adding the opposite of 2x is a negative 2x. Adding the opposite of a positive 7 is a negative 7. So either way you think about it, you get the same answer. But for the majority of students, they seem to, when seeing this, just this negative out in front, they tend to write it as a negative 1 and distribute. Okay? So let's do one more like this. Suppose we had this. Suppose we had an expression that looked like this. All right? Oops, sorry. Suppose we had this. All right, so there's no number there. Remember, it's understood to be a 1. That right here is understood to be a 1, so that's a negative 1. And so then you're going to distribute. And so the answer becomes negative 1 times 2x is a negative 2x. Negative 1 times a negative 3y. Remember, a negative times a negative is a positive. So a negative 1 times a negative 3y is a positive 3y. And a negative 1 times a negative 6 is a positive 6. All right, now let's look at this. All right, now what if we had this? What if we had 3 times 5x minus 1 plus 2? 3 times 5x minus 1 plus 2. So I want to simplify this expression. Notice I have parentheses. I need to get rid of the parentheses. So I'm going to distribute. Now remember, you're only distributing the 3 to each of the numbers that's inside, or each of the terms rather, that's inside the parentheses. So not about this 2. It's only what's inside the parentheses, because when you read it, it says 3 times 5x minus 1, and then whatever that is, you're going to add 2. All right, so when I do this, 3 times 5x is 15x, 3 times a negative 2 is a negative 3, and then plus 2. So that's where I'm at. Now remember, the original directions said this. The original directions said simplify the result if possible. So here I can simplify this. You can simplify. And you can simplify by combining like terms. Combining like terms. And so basically I can add these constants, a negative 3 plus 2. And again, if you can't do this in your mind, if you don't remember how to add signed numbers, use your calculator. A negative 3 plus 2 is a negative 1. So this becomes negative 15x minus 1. And remember, we tend to put the variable, the terms that has a variable in it first and the constant last. So that's why it looks like this. Now there's nothing wrong with writing it as negative 1 plus 15x, but this is what we prefer. Okay, we prefer it to look like this. All right, number 10. All right, number 10, suppose you had this. Suppose you had negative 2 times 5 minus 6x plus 2x. All right, suppose we had that. Okay, well, again, I'm going to distribute. So I'm going to multiply everything in here by this negative 2. And so when I do that, I'm going to get a negative 2 times 5 is a negative 10. a negative 2 times a negative 6x, remember negative times a negative is a positive, so a negative 2 times a negative 6x is a positive 12x, and then we have this 2x right here. Alright, so again, just like we said, we can simplify this, so we can simplify this as well. And so when I combine like terms, I'm going to put the variable term first, so 12x. Now I can combine the, 12x and 2x, I can combine. Those are like terms. So 12x plus 2x is 14x, and then you're left with minus 10. All right, so again, these are like terms. So 12x plus another 2x is 14x minus 10. All right, so that's number 10, the problem number 10. All right, number 11, suppose you had this in number 11. Suppose you had negative 1/4 times 12x minus 16. So negative 1/4 times 12x minus 16. All right, so just like you've been doing, you're going to use the distributive property. All right, now I'm going to write this out. So I'm going to say, so this will become negative 1/4 times 12x, and I'm going to just kind of say this, plus a negative 1/4 times a negative 16. I'm going to write it like that. All right, so negative 1/4 times a negative 16. Now, in a previous course, when you multiplied fractions, I want you to see this, so when you multiply fractions, this becomes negative 1/4 times 12 over 1. See this 12? So you can write 12 as 12 over 1. Now, in a previous course, you tended to reduce first and then multiply. Now, of course, you could have multiplied first and then reduced. It doesn't matter, but sometimes it makes things a lot easier if you reduce first. But if you don't remember how to reduce, you can just multiply first. Multiply the numerators together. Negative 1 times 12 is negative 12, and then the denominator is 4 times 1 is 4, and then you simplify this. 12 divided by 4 is 3, but a negative 12 divided by 4 is a negative 3. So that's negative 3. Now, if you had reduced first, you would have said, let's see, you would have said this. You would have said 4 into 4 is 1, and then 4 into 12 is 3. And so then this becomes negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. 1 times 1 is 1, and then negative 3 divided by 1 is negative 3. So you see, you get the same thing. So whether you multiply first and then reduce, or reduce and then multiply, you get the same answer. Okay, now what I want you to notice though is this. So negative 1/4 times 12x, remember, we know that negative 1/4 times 12 is negative 3, so a negative 1/4 times 12x is a negative 3x. And then over here, you got to remember a negative times a negative. First of all, a negative times a negative is a positive, so it's going to be a positive number right here. But when I look at multiplying 1/4, negative 1/4 times a negative 16 over 1, I'm going to get, if I multiply first, I'm going to get a negative 1 times a negative 16 is a positive 16. 4 times 1 is 4. And when I reduce, 16 divided by 4 is 4. Okay, now positive 4. So this becomes negative 3x plus a positive 4. So plus 4. And so that's your answer there. All right, let's do one more with the fraction. All right, suppose we had this. All right, suppose we had negative 1/8 times 24y plus 16x. So negative 1/8 times 24y plus 16x. So if you distribute, you're going to get negative 1/8 times 24y plus a negative 1/8 times 16x. That's what you get. All right, now let's kind of deal with this product right here. So this really is negative 1/8 times 24 that I need to look at. And so if I reduce, I'm going to go ahead and reduce first. If I reduce, I'm going to get 8 into 8 is 1, 8 into 24 is 3. So this becomes negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. 1 times 1 is 1, so that's just negative 3. Now what that means then for this right here is this. So if negative 1/8 times 24 is a negative 3, then negative 1/8 times 24y is a negative 3y. Okay, now let's do that one. So plus, now let's look at this. All right, so this time I have negative 1/8 times 16. I'll write this 16 is 16 over 1. If I reduce first, 8 into 8 is 1, 8 into 16 is 2. It usually helps if you use the largest common factor. So the largest common factor of 8 and 16 is 8. Now you could have used 2, you could have used 4, but in the end it's quicker if you use the greatest one. So the largest common factor, the greatest common factor. And so then this becomes negative 1 times 2 is a negative 2. 1 times 1 is 1, so that's just negative 2. Now what that means is this right here, that's going to be negative 2x. Now don't write the answer like this. All right, so remember we talked about this before. So adding a negative number means the same thing as subtraction. So this becomes negative 3y minus 2x. So that's how you write this. So remember, plus a negative 2x means minus 2x. Because remember, in a previous course, when you had 8 minus, let's say 10, that means the same thing. See the subtraction? That means the same thing as adding the opposite. And the opposite of positive 10 is a negative 10. So this becomes 8 plus, and then the opposite, get negative 10. So this right here kind of looks like this right here. So remember, adding a negative number means the same thing as subtracting that opposite. All right. So that's number 12. Okay, now let's look at the next part, still dealing with distributive property. The directions here are going to say this. The directions are going to say use distributive property, to write each sum as a product. So use distributive property to write each sum as a product. All right, looks like this is number 1. Okay, number 1, suppose we had this. Suppose we had 4 times 1 plus 4 times x. Okay, 4 times 1 plus 4 times x. So basically you're going backwards, so to speak. So when each of you recognizes this, see how these two terms both have a 4 in it, and 4 is one of the factors. So that means that I was somehow distributing a 4 originally. So we have had 4 times something plus 4 times something. That's what this says. So if you think about it, this is, you were distributing 4, so you'd say 4 times, and then you would say 4 times what? Is this 4 times 1? Well, the answer is 1. Plus, and then 4 times what would be 4 times x, and the answer is x. So that's what they wanted there. It looks complicated, but it really isn't. You just, whatever you write here, just distribute and see if you get this back. 4 times 1 plus 4 times x, and that's what it is. All right, so remember, you want to write this sum as a product using distributive property. Number 2, suppose you had 8x minus 8y. 8x minus 8y. Again, notice that see how these 8's are the same here? The coefficients are the same. So at some point, you were looking at something like this. So you're going to use a distributive property. So 8 times x would be 8x minus 8 times y would be 8y. So there's your answer there. So it's kind of like you're doing it backwards. You're going backwards. Number 3, suppose you had this for number 3. Suppose you had 40x plus 40y. 40x plus 40y. Again, notice they have 40s in common, so you're going to say 40 times and then x plus y. because 40 times x is 40x, and then 40 times y is 40y. All right, and then what if you had this? Suppose we had negative 2 times x plus negative 2 times y. Suppose we had that. Well, notice that both of these have a negative 2 in common, both of those terms. And so in terms of the distributive property, what that means is that originally I would have had this, negative 2 times, and see I can factor out a negative 2, so it'll be x plus y. And for this one, be a little bit careful. Some students will say x minus y, but that's not true. So be careful. The answer is not negative 2 times x minus y. Because if you think about it, when I distribute, that's negative 2 times x is negative 2x, but a negative 2 times a negative y is a positive 2y, and that's not what this was. See, this was negative 2x plus a negative 2y, and that's not the same thing. Okay? So it's not this. So the answer is this right here, because it kind of makes sense now. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x, and then plus, and then negative 2 times y is negative 2y. All right, and so that's how you do there. That was part of the lesson dealing with distributive properties. So that's going to take care of this part of the lesson.